Hi everyone, hope your week 8s are going swimmingly. Today we'll be presenting our study on inner monologues. So how would you define an inner monologue? Ben Alderson Day more officially defines it as the subjective experience of language in the absence of overt and audible articulation. But you probably know it more colloquially as the little voice in your brain that may or may not be narrating your thoughts throughout the day. So a lot of research has recently emerged on this topic, with some studies indicating that some people actually do not have an inner monologue. So we are wondering, how does a mind with an inner monologue process language differently from a mind without? More specifically, how does the presence of an inner monologue impact problem solving when one is provided linguistically incongruent or incomplete stimuli?
Our group posited three hypotheses. The first being the presence of an inner speech negatively interferes with automatic synaptic processing but primes semantic processing. The second being the presence of increased speech allows for increased accuracy in word prediction. The third being the presence of an inner monologue is inversely correlated with preference for visual self expression. Moving on to the methodology. So we first identified the presence of each participant's inner speech, and we did this by asking them a pre-task survey in which we asked them about how they complete various everyday tasks. Based on their answers, each participant was assigned an inner monologue score based on a scale of 1 through 6. Moving on to the tasks. The first task was the Holbert task, and it provided participants with a visual stimulus and requested that they express their immediate thoughts through any preferred modality. So they had multiple writing utensils and they could either draw or write their response. So this allowed us to categorize participants as either visual learning or non-visual learning. We also had a post-task survey in which participants self-reported whether they believe that they have an inner monologue or not. The next two tasks posited how inner speech can affect language processing. So the first task asked participants to choose the synaptically correct but the semantically incorrect word to complete a sentence. The second task was called Finish the Story, and it asked subjects to predict the upcoming word in an ongoing story. Moving on to the results. So we had 20 participants for the Holbert task, and it seemed as though visual participants scored on average higher in accuracy with 12.22 out of 16 compared to non-visual learners on the sentence congruency task with a score of 10.8 over 16.
All right, so now moving on to the results from the sentence congruency task, which, if you recall, was the random 16 sentences where 8 of those were semantically incongruent sentences and 8 of those were semantically congruent sentences. And the participants had to choose one of the 3 words that was the only grammatically correct word that fit. And so in this example, their blank hurts a lot. The correct response would be spoon. And there were two little hypotheses that we had for this task. Participants could either be like storing the whole sentence in their head, and then when they see the answers, they could be their feet hurts a lot, their spoon hurts a lot, their cuts hurts a lot, and seeing that spoon is the only one that grammatically fits. Or participants could be storing just the tense person number of the filler word and select the only option that fits there. And so in this case, their blank hurts a lot needs a singular noun, and spoon is the only singular noun that they could choose. And so to analyze this, we took the response times and differentiated between those, the semantically congruent and then the semantically incongruent sentences, and ignored incorrect responses just so we could find any trend between those correct responses if an effect was taking place between those congruent and incongruent sentences. And we analyzed the response time difference, this RTD, in milliseconds, which was calculated by the average response time for correct incongruent responses, and subtracted from that the average response time for correct congruent responses. And so the first result that we had, we took those response time differences and graphed those with the averages from the pre-survey score, and we couldn't really see a trend. A lot of the averages of the pre-survey were around in the same area. So we later on decided we're just gonna go question by question to see if there are any trends that were question specific that really showed an inner monologue hypothesis trend. And so before doing that, though, we trimmed down the responses to just those who answered at least half of the semantically incongruent sentence correct, like 4 or more, and then at least half of the semantically incongruent as well. So both half semantically congruent, semantically incongruent. And we had 2 questions that showed decent trends. The first one was from the pre-survey. When attending a lecture, do you prefer to have more figures or written notes in the PowerPoint? To which participants would choose a lower score for if they preferring figures or images, or so like having an inner monologue, or if they preferred a higher score if they preferred written notes, so they didn't have an inner monologue. And here with this trend, the slope of 0.0033 shows that participants who supposedly had an inner monologue and preferring pictures, figures, and images had much less difference in their semantically incongruent responses and semantically congruent, in that it was like much easier for them to complete the semantically incongruent sentences when compared to congruent. And then the other question that we did have a trend for was, do you feel that you word things better in your head than you do in speech or writing? To which participants would have a lower score in having no inner monologue, when that yes, things do sound much better in my head, or a higher score reflecting inner monologue, saying no, I can verbally, visually express ideas as well as I can word them internally. And so here with this most significant slope of 0.072, we saw that the participants who supposedly had a higher inner monologue did have that smallest difference, that less of a difference between those semantically incongruent sentences to semantically congruent. So although these questions were reversed in the sense that the way the participants responded, this lower one here was preference for an inner monologue, while the higher one here, both questions did show that higher inner monologue and a higher inner monologue rating reflected the smallest differences between response lines for semantically incongruent to semantically congruent. And so now we're going to get on to the results for the finish the story task.
Our final finish the story task yielded inconclusive results. As a whole, our participants responded with an average of 7.84 exactly correct responses out of 18, which is a total accuracy of about 44%. Our results also took note of answers that were synonymous with the correct answer, and when including those responses, our participants scored with about 56% accuracy, averaging 10.1 correct or nearly correct responses out of 18. Relating our results from this task back to our original hypothesis requires differentiating our participants by their degree of presence of inner monologues. Their responses to the first question in our post-survey were used to separate them. The question asked if participants believed they had an inner monologue after reading its academic definition and reflecting. Participants rated themselves on a scale of 1 to 6. They were then sorted into 3 groups representing different areas on the spectrum, from weak to moderate to strong presence. Unfortunately, as I will further discuss, our results across different groups did not yield definitive results in line with our second hypothesis, which stated that increased presence of inner monologues primes upcoming word prediction. Before diving into our results, a further description of our separated groups clearly demonstrates some flaws in our experimental design. The varying sample sizes regarding different levels of inner monologue presence, as you can note, one group contained only 1 participant, while another contained 2, compared to the third group of 15, do not allow for definitive results. Further, the self-reporting nature of our participants' responses to this question leaves room for speculation. Even with an academic definition alongside our inquiry, their responses may have been uninformed or inaccurate. Regarding our findings, as seen in the graph, our results do not demonstrate a clear trend. The responses of our participant who scored with a weak to no presence of inner monologue were significantly less accurate than the averages of our other groups. This person scored with 28% correct and 44% synonymous responses in comparison to the other group scores of approximately 45% correct and 58% synonymous. However, the inconsistent sample sizes and lack of pattern across the spectrum as a whole render these findings statistically insignificant. Further, as seen in the graph, the results from our other 2 groups trend in the opposite direction from our hypothesis. Participants with moderate inner monologue presence averaged 2% more correct responses and 3% more synonymous answers than those with a strong presence. Unfortunately, given these contradicting and inconsistent results, our calculated values cannot support our second hypothesis.
So we've looked at the results from each of the experiments individually. Now we're going to take a look at how the different components of the study related to one another. So from the pre-survey responses, we defined this measure called the inner monologue score, or IMS. And this was simply each participant's average rating across pre-survey questions, normalized such that 6 denoted the highest degree of inner monologue usage, and 1 denoted the lowest degree. One of the most striking results we found was this strong and statistically significant negative correlation between IMS and performance on sentence congruency task. So what does this tell us? Well, this does tentatively support the first hypothesis, and the idea is that if you have this internal monologue running when you're reading and digesting written information, then your automatic syntactic processing may be inhibited, but your semantic processing may be primed. In particular, this one pre-survey question that asked, do you mouth words when reading a difficult scientific article? This exhibited a particularly strong negative correlation with IMS score with an acceptable p-value. However, all that being said, the validity of the IMS was questionable. The correlation between IMS and subjective inner monologue ratings that participants gave on the post-survey was slight and not particularly statistically significant. On the bright side, however, some pre-survey questions were highly predictive of subjective inner monologue ratings. For instance, this question, do you prefer subtitles when you're watching a movie in a language that you're fluent in, that is, this positively predicted subjective inner monologue ratings with an acceptable p-score. Likewise, do you mouth words when reading a difficult scientific article had a positive correlation with subjective IM score and a decent p-value. On the flip side, do you give yourself silent pep talks before presentations? This negatively correlated with subjective IM ratings, again with a statistically acceptable p-value. And then do you rehearse before ordering at a restaurant? Again, negatively correlated with subjective IM ratings with a decent p-value. And I'm going to discuss this bonus but weaker result. So there was some correlation between IM ratings and performance on the sentence congruency task, subjective IM ratings, that is. But the correlation was pretty slight, and that should say a p right there. The p-value was not too great. So this tentatively corroborates the correlation I showed 2 slides back. So you might be wondering, how do other parts of the study relate to one another? Such as, how does the second post-survey question that asked people about their preference for written versus visual expression correlate with performance on each of the tasks? And how do pre-survey responses correlate with that post-survey question? Well, the short and disappointing answer is that most correlations were pretty small and statistically insignificant, with pretty large p-values and r values pretty close to 0. However, there were some more general statistics worth noting. So the average inner monologue score was 3.8 out of 6. So there was some slight bias toward having an inner monologue, as gauged by the pre-survey. However, the average subjective inner monologue rating was 5.2. So that's a much more definitive bias in favor of having an inner monologue. Lastly, the average preference for written versus visual expression was 4.8 out of 6.0. And that probably makes some intuitive sense. Most people are probably more inclined to express themselves textually as opposed to pictorially or using diagrams.
Now, we've given you a lot of information, so let's distill and return back to the hypotheses. Our first hypothesis, the presence of inner speech negatively interferes with automatic syntactic processing, but prime semantic processing, was confirmed, as those with higher IMS generally tended to score lower on the sentence congruency task. However, they tended to have smaller differences in reaction times when they were given semantically congruent versus semantically incongruent sentences. As Joey said, for a second hypothesis, inner speech allows for increased accuracy in word prediction, remains unconfirmed due to insignificant trends in the data. Similarly, our third hypothesis, inner speech is correlated with the preference for visual self-expression, was unconfirmed due to insignificant data trends. There was no significant correlation between preference for visual or textual expression and IMS. Hence, we can't really say that those with inner monologues generally tend to be more or less visual thinkers. Obviously, more research needs to be done on the subject. Ben Alderson-Day was able to consolidate most of the psycholinguistics research done so far on this topic into his one article, which we use as background reference. But that's all we have for you guys today. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you to everyone who participated in our experiment. And thank you, Samantha, for all your input and advice. Happy week 8, everyone.